was inspired by her desire to hit the ground running and begin to give the citizens of Harrisburg what they need most, a mayor that cares. We very much look forward to the opportunity to work with her and assist her in accomplishing successful initiatives for the betterment of Harrisburg. January also saw 2 new leaders elected to city council. Thank you. Mark, the fan just went off, so the heat is going down. Daniel Bowers now serves as the president, and Alsha Green serves as the vice president. We've come to know them over the years because they were incumbents, so we're also looking forward to working with both of them, as we did with then President of Council Wanda Williams and Vice President Ben Allen. I think we're going to turn immediately to the discussion of the 2020 audit. Doug, Ralph, Jeffrey, and I were able to attend the presentation of the audit by Matt Wilderson from the firm Boyer and Ritter. As you know, or as you may remember, it's in the audit that they make a special presentation to the ICA board. And for the last 2 years, we have tried to accommodate by just joining in the presentation with the audit committee. And I did get a note, a very nice note from Bill Schambach, who is the chair, and who said that he really enjoyed having the 4 of us join because it added an additional dynamic to the conversation. And we could follow along threads as we ask questions. We shared, are these the 2? This is the one for.
Yes.
Carla.
Okay.
Okay. This is a handout that we got at that meeting. And I've asked Ralph if he would lead, try and guide the discussion as we share with you what we learned, the good and the bad. And then Doug and I and Jeffrey can chime in as needed. So thank you, Ralph.
Yeah, I took a couple notes from our attendance at the meeting. And I think that at a high level, you would say that there's a lot less bad. What remains that is bad is kind of there's kind of a light at the end of the tunnel here. The great news is, again, for it's been several years in a row, the city did get a clean opinion on the CAFR. So that's good. Users of financial statements can have confidence that that the results presented are high quality. There is a management communications letter that's part of the scope of their audit, and that contains serious but informal sort of suggestions on processes and ways to improve. And I understand that it's kind of a collaborative list of suggestions that is, throughout the course of the year when they work, with Brian and folks at the city, they develop these lists of suggestions together. The third component that they reviewed was the single audit. This is where there's still some bad, and the single audit has to do with certain entitlement type programs. For example, CDBG funding. There's audit procedures that are required, and those fall under what they call the single audit. And the note that I made an asterisk next to was Matt Wilderson's comment that the city has made significant progress. Then when the first one that we attended at the time, it was kind of alarming because there was a number of findings, and there were findings of things that they called material weaknesses and significant deficiencies. And it was a long list, and at the time it was 14 items, and now it's down to 4. And there's, I think, sort of, like I said, light at the end of the tunnel that all of those items are manageable, and they're all things that the city, I think, has a grasp of and knows what it takes in order to correct those findings. So some of them involve things like IT processes, and fixing those involves decisions on what to do with the city's IT software. So that doesn't necessarily mean these findings will all be eliminated in the coming year for the next audit, but it does mean that that the findings are things that are being managed. Okay.
And can I just one quick interjection? This is the audit for 2020. So when you say the coming year, it has already passed. the next, so.
Right.
It's sort of like the ship has sailed.
Right. That's a good point. The biggest highlight out of the single audit is that, again, that they did give a qualified opinion. So that is a bad thing. And that's okay. That's okay because that's in the rearview mirror, but I think going forward, I think it's the expectation that there is a clean opinion and unqualified opinion for the 2021 audit for the single audit. The other thing Gloria and Ritter said that I thought was important was that they've met with the outgoing mayor, and then they also met with the transition team, and they did take time to review the findings in detail. The last of the components that they reviewed was the management letter. There are some technical issues that they communicate through what they call the management letter. There's something that they have had on there since, like, I think 2006. It's been a pretty long time, and it's an inventory of the capital assets of the city, and something that really needs, that they recommend it needs to get done with best practices. There was a couple of issues raised in the management letter regarding the sanitation, the financial management to do with sanitation. One of them had to do with write-offs and what they called on a sort of an as needed, or there's a funny phrase they use in quotes. It was like an as needed type of understanding as understood method of write-offs as opposed to a formal policy. And the second one had to do with collections efforts, and again, a lack of a formal policy. And I think we've observed the financial ramifications of the city's collections rate being low. They spoke a little bit about some pretty technical issues related to the collections of things like mercantile tax, how the city does it in practice versus ways they may potentially do it that might potentially increase the system of checks and balances between the treasurer's office and the city. And then the last thing had to do with reconciling receivable Capital Region Water that actually dates to the creation of Capital Region Water when it spun off. And I believe there's some shared services, that there's some accounting that needs to get done. And from some of the comments that we heard, it sounds like the city, starting with Brian, they know what they need to do there. And I believe there's some outreach that's made on that issue. So that's all my notes. That's the things I thought were the highlights to touch on for the rest of the members here. And anybody wants to add any comments or color, I'll conclude there.
Well, I'll note that I wasn't able to stay for the entire meeting. I left about a half hour, 40 minutes into it. But I heard the initial presentation and some of the initial questions. I'd agree with Ralph's assessment also after taking a look through the documents and so on, that the city has made some exceptional progress. I think the note about it being the 2020, but also that it's a work in progress, that while the audit's being accomplished, they're also in regular contact with the city staff. So they are concurrently working on the processes and procedures that need to be implemented going forward. So I'm hopeful that I know Brian's been working on that and trying to get toward low goals. So we'll see what 2021 goes. I also noted they said they were pleased that the books were in better condition, that they were able to conclude the audit a little bit sooner than the last couple of cycles as well, which is also important.
Just to note, this is the second year that Boy and Ritter have done the audit, and it was time to get a new auditor, which then Chairman Alex Reavers, that was his mission to make sure before he stepped down that the city did that. And I think it was just heartening to hear how honestly Matt spoke about what was going on, and it didn't seem like it was language that had just been retreaded, which I think in the past we've seen. Anything else?
Sure, I just wanted to point out, jump on one of the things that Ralph had mentioned. There are a number of things in the management letter that have to do with the IT department. I know that we had spoken last year. The board was concerned about the progress being made in the IT for the city. And the suggestion was made at that meeting of the audit committee, which also might apply to this board, is that perhaps at a future meeting, the IT department should come forward and give an updated presentation on all the great work that they're doing to try to turn the corner on the, what is clearly agreed to be a fairly antiquated system, not connected, no reports, hard to follow. And so there is, that is a goal that's definitely light at the end of the tunnel, but perhaps the ICA board would like to some point schedule an update yourselves from the IT department. And have them come to a future meeting and talk about some of the great work that they're doing to bring Harrisburg into the 21st century.
Any questions, Carla? This is your first exposure to this. I do want to remind everyone, you mentioned the CAFR, which is the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report of the City of Harrisburg. It's about 300 pages, but it's an amazing resource. You can find almost anything in it. So if you're looking for anything having to do with the finances, I would recommend you take a look at that. Probably not into that. We need to save a few trees.
Picking up on some of Jeffrey's comments, if I were to kind of sort of prognosticate how I'd like to see the next 6 to 12 months perhaps play out, I think the first thing would be that with the new administration, I think there's an opportunity where they've reopened the budget, and then they're going to have an opportunity to submit a 5-year plan. So I think the important thing is for us to have a good open channel of communication with everybody at the administration, and to kind of maybe assist as needed. Otherwise, let them ascertain what the priorities are and where the resources are best dedicated. And then once that draft of the 5-year plan begins to come together, we can kind of line up what we see as important issues and ways in which we can continue to help support the city's efforts to advance the cause of financial stability.
Sounds good.
Great. Thank you, Ralph, for reading that.
Thank you.
Now we're going to move on to the 2021, move forward 1 year, year-end numbers. And Brian is going to lead us through some of that. And I believe you're part of one of the documents you'll use to help guide is the DCED filing that you do. It's monthly on the 15th of each month.
That's correct.
So again, it's there for anyone to take a look at, and it gets updated. And I like it because there's narrative that's attached to the questions, and DCED have come up with the questions, and so they're consistent. And so you can easily sort of compare month to month and also see where they're going. And it's on our website. So I can do that.
Those are extras.
Does anyone need a copy of the most recent? Oh, no.
Just in case.
I'll just take it for that because I didn't print all the last page. So it's yours. You're for Brian.
Okay, yes, thanks again, Audrey and board members. I appreciate being here in Marita's absence. And thank you for attending the audit committee meeting. I think that's a good approach to keep you better informed too.
I apologize, Brian. The air conditioner came back on, so if you could speak a little louder.
I crank it up a little
A
bit.
little bit, I'm sorry.
That's
It's-
okay.
That white noise really doesn't help.
Yes, at the audit committee, we had, one thing I brought there was what Audrey just went through, the monthly report that we do, which is a good glimpse of actual activity, revenue and expenditures. And there's also comparatives to the budget and also prior year-to-date numbers. So it's, as each month goes by, you get a running idea of where the city is in comparison to prior year. And one of the things that stood out to me on that report for the year ended 2021, it would be the change in our year-to-date revenues and expenditures compared to prior year 2020. For revenues, the city had a favorable increase of about 5.5%. And corresponding to that, the expenditures year-to-date, 21 versus 20, they increased 20%. But the main reason for that, if you factor out the significant debt item that happened in November, where the city defeased the bonds, the stadium improvement bonds that were issued by the redevelopment authority back in 2005. But it's the city is responsible, have been responsible for that debt as the guarantor Coupled with that, we finally made a significant payment against the forbearance liability with our bond insurer, AMBAC Assurance. And of course, as you know, they're in the mix because of the default that happened back in 2012 and 2013 on the GO debt. So that was a $4 million payment coupled with the defeasance. You back that out, what happens is then you get a great comparison where revenue, as I said, increased 5.5% and expenditures increased 5.6%. So it's a very comparable consistency I'm seeing with that, you know, despite what we've all gone through in the last 2 years. That's the main highlight of the, I believe, of the report. Also to note, and that's for the general fund. Again, the cash balance at the beginning of the year for the city was 32.1 million. And we ended up with a cash position of a little over 27 million. So despite the roughly $9 million extraordinary item, the city dropped its cash position by $5 million, so there's a roughly $4 million excess over actual expenditures by the revenues that were generated, which was really a positive thing despite the parking revenue that we rely on and we budget on over the years, which is around about 2.2 million. We didn't receive anything that's related to the bonds, the PEDFA bonds, the parking system, and also the ground lease payment that we get from Harrisburg Parking Authority. So we did well in terms of maintaining, managing the expenses versus the revenue. Any questions on that? A summary on the general.
One question, something that comes up here, like feels like at least 2 or 3 times a year, has to do with the difference between the city's reports and the controller's monthly reports. And the controller always includes encumbrances when they talk about the cash balance. So
Sure.
you referenced the actual cash balance, which is in the bank account, and someone might go to the city or our website and download the controller's report and see a number that's significantly less than that, which was 22.5 million. Can you talk a little bit about that and maybe give any color to the actual numbers at your end?
Yes, and that relates primarily to the outstanding encumbrances or purchase orders that are still open at the end of the year. Those are still solid commitments that the city has to pay. They're outstanding in the sense that they may relate to ongoing projects that didn't quite wrap up within 2021. So they're going to be, and they continue on. They roll forward to current year 2022. So there's no discrepancy there in that sense. We're aware that our system reflects that in our report. I just did my report based on actual cash in, cash out, and in cash. But it is proper to do that because you need to take that into account to show that really your cash is here, but it's a bit lower because of those outstanding encumbrances. So the controller's office is just covering the full picture, which actually that's something I've come to understand better, and also work closer with Bill and Charlie on their understanding and how they report that information. So I get what that. So there's no dispute with them. That's very good.
And then could you just speak to the expenditures that you had referenced earlier for year to date? How do the encumbrances tie or not tie into the year-to-date expenditures? Are the expenditures cash basis or cash plus encumbrances?
They are cash basis, right? So those expenditures are not reflected there because they haven't actually happened yet. So those expenditures will materialize on the 2022 books. Cash basis, but then of course for the, when we do our audits and our audit preparation, if it's a little bit, the encumbrances are one thing, but if we don't have any invoices that come in that have been submitted, that we haven't paid for current year that relate to those encumbrances, there won't be any associated liability with that, because again, these encumbrances tend to cover multiple years. But there are instances where we will receive invoices in this month that relate to those outstanding encumbrances. So for the audit, we'll be accruing those amounts properly for our accounts payable account.
So encumbrances are not technically the same as what in accounting they would call like accrued liabilities. They're not exactly the same. If they haven't been invoiced,
Right.
it wouldn't be a liability, but it's still an encumbrance for your purchase order.
Right. And we do, in the fund balance section of the statement of position, though they're down below, they are identified, where it's not that they're in the equity section showing that the fund balance has been committed, to those encumbrances. We normally break them down by the function, whether they're public safety, public works. So they are included. They're just not in. They're there as a reminder that there's still a commitment, but there's no associated accounts payable with them just at that time. Sort of, it's a combination. Like some are in payables and some are not. It gets pretty detailed. It is a combination.
Perfect, thank you.
It's very hard with masks because you can't show that you're smiling. That you understand this, and it's instead poor Brian's going, oh, what are they doing?
It just comes up multiple times per year, depending on who's presenting the number. If it's the auditors versus the city versus the controller's office.
Can I ask a question on encumbrances just to keep them theme? Our experience, Brian, is that there are two types of encumbrances which are not exactly the same. I don't want to get too into the weeds, so I'll just give you the subject. One is blanket purchase orders. And what we find is that a lot of departments open up blanket purchase orders, and they're not necessarily accurate. They're just encumbering their budgetary allotment. And that's not necessarily putting a lot of thought into the potential for what that purchase order is going to be used for. So I just ask you as we go forward to maybe examine whether or not the city is using blanket purchase orders in the most effective way. The second one has to do with capital projects, but they're almost always multi-year projects.
Sure.
So those are encumbrances which very often, and it doesn't have to be capital like it's in the capital fund. Sometimes it's just things that are adding capital value. And those are purchase orders where clearly they're going to straddle multiple years. And so those purchase orders are going to live beyond one fiscal year. And so having a handle, and I'm going to look back to Ralph, because Ralph has had some concerns in the past about reporting on capital projects, whether or not the city has in the past done a really good job of organizing what's outstanding and also what the future, within the 1 or 2 or 3 fiscal years, what those amounts really are. And so there's been some concern on the ICA board that maybe the capital project reporting isn't entirely accurate, because it takes a little bit of work to figure those things out beforehand. And I know, Ralph, I don't know if you want to expound on it.
Sure. I mean, on the, I would say that the reporting was we thought it was perfectly accurate when it was describing what happened in the past,
Right.
but to use financial accounting tools to help manage the capital expenditure process, we couldn't find if it was being done. We could request after the fact, was the project completed or partially completed as of a point such as the end of the year? And if so, how, what do the numbers say? But like I said, we couldn't find that there were like schedules of values that were being used on a month-by-month basis to monitor the progress of those projects. So that's potentially on the table as an area where the city might, once it gets a 5-year plan in place with us, they might want to look at that as a potential budgeting tool, tied in with IT. That could be something that the city looks to use as a management tool, to help drive both implementation of capital expenditures and really have more control over implementation and the financial management of it.
Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up on that. We do closely review such expenditures, and we use certain accounts that are prefixed in a certain way that represent a capital expenditure. The purpose of that is to help me know that while we're expending it as as an expenditure during the year, it's something that we're going to be capitalizing into our fixed asset system. And as to the encumbrances, you know, that like you say, Jeff, there's some capital, there's some service, some supplies. Our account structure is laid out that way. You know what accounts represent what category, and the category matches the budget ordinance, how it's adopted. So in the end, and this is important for what we're going through right now, to have, we will be able to run a report at some point that can tell you what POs, what encumbrances are rolled forward into the new year, that back off and the cash. That's what I'm talking about. And it can be broken down by those categories, including capital. We call it other in the ordinance, but it's predominantly capital items. So those are, what I'm trying to say is that it's readily identifiable through that process. So, and I think I've finally developed a better understanding on how to reflect that and how to report that, and also how that impacts the next year's the budget preparation that we're doing right now.
Thank you.
I didn't know if you wanted to talk at all. Sorry.
Oh,
I didn't.
yeah, that was the general fund. The other piece that I reviewed and presented to everybody at the audit committee was the same type of presentation on the neighborhood services fund. I mean, there's been a good deal of focus and I think some concern on that fund because it's expanded. It started out back in 2016 as a way to recreate a different piece of the city, and also taking some burden off of the general fund. Mainly funded by the city's trash collection services. And then in recent years, prior to 2021, the city moved forward with an agreement or a partnership with the borough of Steelton to provide that borough with trash collection services and also handle the billing services. And that started in the middle of 2019. So along comes 2021, and that gets expanded to two more boroughs, Pembroke and Paxton. So the results right now in the schedule I presented are combined. I just had a column that reflected all three boroughs. But what we want to do with this budget that we're developing right now is to break them out, to make them more just that, easier to see the activity on a borough by borough basis. So you have that component of the neighborhood services fund, and then also there's the main activity, the city residential and business activity that pertains to that fund. And overall, between the two, the intergovernmental municipalities, the three boroughs, we ended up with a net revenue of $200,000. I don't have this meeting. I don't have the breakout, but I can tell you, Steelton continues to be very, very strong. Pembroke is off to a good start too. It actually had a good net revenue result. Paxton ended up with a efficiency, revenue versus expenditures, predominantly because there was an upfront cost that happened right away for that borough with the purchase of the toters, which pretty much makes up the shortfall. So the fund taking that's the three boroughs piece, but the remainder of the fund on a cash basis, and this reflects the collection scenario and concern, where expenses exceeded revenue by $380,000. So there was a net loss on the cash basis side for that fund. So again, this will play a role in our analysis that we're currently doing to try to put together a related budget for this fund for the current year.
Brian, you said that in looking back, that there was a net deficiency in the neighborhood services fund. The one of the concerns that the ICA board has articulated had to do with that subject of outstanding receivables for the fund. And there's been a lot of discussion and numbers going around about what truly is the outstanding receivables for the fund. Do you have any handle on what that might be? Is that, some sort of magnitude discussion as to whether or not there's a lot of money owed by customers or not?
I mean, it's a huge amount.
Okay.
That's there. I can't give you the.
Huge is the adjective.
But and because it's so huge, the city is still wants to actively pursue collection of it. So I think part of that huge amount, of course, has been impacted in the last year or two, predominantly because of the effects of the pandemic and the economy. But it's probably the biggest challenge right now.
Would it be safe to say that if collections were improved, that gap between revenue and expenditures in the fund might have been closed? Or partially closed?
I would think so. If I don't have a comparative, for 2020 or even 2019, prior to things going awry. But I think, if our collections could be what you would normally expect them to be, I think would be very, very close to at least a break-even scenario.
Because the numbers have gotten as great as $14 million was one of the numbers that had come out of John Miller's office. And I think one of the pleas, he also attended the meeting, one of his pleas was for the administration to consider reinstating penalties. Because right now, because of the emergency declaration, I believe those are pulled back. And as he said, if there's no penalties, there's no carry. So it makes it really difficult to get people to pay.
It makes your enforcement task that much more difficult.
So the good news is the fact that it's reinstated, hopefully you'd see that right away as well. And I think as Ralph indicated, the Neighborhood Services Fund is another one of those areas as everything, as the administration matures and looks at its budget, is another place that we hope to concentrate on and help in whatever way we can. Because speaking for myself, the one concern I've always had with the intermunicipal agreements is that in the end, I wouldn't want the citizens of Harrisburg to suffer because we've gone too far with these agreements. And the last administration had made a comment that if it doesn't work out, we'll just tax the citizens of Harrisburg more. And that, again, in my opinion, certainly should never be the case. So that's
Well,
it.
I mean, to that point, under the current practice, with the current collections rate being extremely low, the general fund is to a certain extent propping up the neighborhood services fund. So that means that the taxpayers of the city are propping up the ratepayers. And the ratepayers, as you know, consist of a lot of landlords, commercial property owners, people who are not necessarily residents. There's probably, from just shooting from the hip, there's probably a nice disparity there of sort of propping up of those trash collection activities from the general fund, which is predominantly, citizens and taxpayers.
I will speak on behalf of Mr. Grover, who's not here today, but he would like to remind the board that, and he always does at this point in the conversation, that there's ongoing litigation that the city engages in over some of those collections and some of those accounts. And obviously, we're not privy to any of that. But that litigation is continuing, and it's actually charging the opposite of what you contend, which is that the general fund is taking resources as opposed to the neighborhood services fund taking resources.
I mean, he did say that, but in the city's 5-year plan, there's an initiative to improve the collections rate to a rate which is sustainable and which is based on peer municipalities that perform similar services. So I don't think that there's any litigation that prevents the city from collecting customer accounts for disposal and sanitation. I think it's really important. And we see that, Brian mentioned, you mentioned the loss in the cash basis of 380,000. I'm just curious if you're, where that can be, how to tie into that, because the sheet that I saved from the audit committee says 419,000.
Right, and if you offset that, Ralph, by the next two columns,
Yeah,
the old sanitation and disposal funds are really part of the neighborhood services. They were absorbed into it. So that's where I get to the 380 when you factor in those two positive net numbers.
because you're adding 69,000 for sanitation funds for liens revenue,
Correct.
and then 167,000 for liens revenue
For disposal, that's correct. The overall. But the cash position on that fund, it was right around 7 million at the beginning of 21, and it's at the end of the year, it's down to 6.8 million. Before encumbrances.
which leads to my next, same question as general funds. In the controller's report, they take into account encumbrances and they report a deficit of 1.1 million. Any color to the encumbrances that they have in there, that's the difference between the cash basis and the controller's encumbrance basis?
I'm just trying to recall what might make up the encumbrances for that fund. At the moment, I can't recall. But that would be the difference with what, the total of those outstanding commitments at the end of the year. Part of it relates to I think there might be some capital items in that total, given it so much.
For example, a contract to purchase something which hasn't actually been paid for yet, or hasn't been delivered yet.
That would be correct. Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't recall the other, a little more detail on that makeup. For what that might be, but that would be accurate for what they have in their report, because that comes right from the accounting system.
Thanks.
There is a little good news to report on this fund, by the way. The city just recently received a payment from Lancaster County Solid Waste of $222,000, which is the rebate. The city actually, the tonnage that was generated in 2021 was enough to hit that threshold, above that threshold, which is very significant. That's the largest rebate payment. We have received two in the past, but they haven't been that as large as that. So that was very unexpected. It's very welcome for current.
That reminds me of a question. There was also an escrow that was escrow that the waste management held. And I think we got one part of that paid back 2 years ago. Do you know how much is left?
Yeah.
Is it like 950?
It was, the total originally was 1,350,000, I believe. And we've received 850,000. I think there's 500,000 still on deposit. Right. Yeah, sure. So that's the summary of both funds. Any further comments or questions?
And Brian, please know that we don't expect you to keep all these numbers in your head, because between doing your budget, getting the audit out of there, I don't even want to think about the number of numbers that could go crosswise up there. So always feel free to say, I don't know if it.
Oh, sure. No problem.
Anything else? We'll move on next to the new administration. And barely, well, it's not even 4 weeks in. So let's call it 3 weeks in. There was a great article in Penn Live today, if you had a chance to see it, about the administration and the mayor's approach. And in it, we saw front and center that the priority is pulling together the budget. They're taking what was a placeholder budget and figuring out how to reauthorize a budget that is appropriate to the priorities that they see going forward. And there will be several presentations of the budget, and we try as an ICA to participate, mainly just listening and learning as much as possible. And so the budget is presented on the 1st of February to City Council, and the budget, the administration hopes, and it must be, I guess, be approved on February 15th. In the interim, on the 8th, 9th, and 10th, there are presentations that will be held, and we will make sure that one of us or more of us are listening or there to hear what is going on. And what will happen is, so that finishes on the, what's called the 10th, the hearings. For the ICA to share its thoughts, it's before our next meeting. So I would like to ask for a motion that Jeffrey could collate opinions, reactions to the budget, and so that we can then put them in a letter form and share them with the administration before, obviously, the 15th. Hopefully we do that weekend before. So could I ask for a motion to allow Jeffrey to collate and me to work to draft a letter to share?
Make a motion to authorize Jeffrey and Audrey to assemble and then ultimately deliver a letter to the city with any helpful comments or suggestions on behalf of the ICA regarding the city budget.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Anything else as far as the current administration? What? But I mean, we're appreciative that you're here, and I did email Dan today to say he's always welcome to come, and that if he ever wants to be on the agenda, we are happy to do that. And as a reminder, Brian's here today. Next month, we will see Marita sitting there. So we're very excited about that because it's a great change. And it's also great, Brian, just to get to see you at least twice in a week. I can't believe that. Anything else? There's not. I will turn it over to Jeffrey, who has a very, very brief report.
I do. All we have this month is the bills paid report, which I distributed to the board. We had a number of December and January invoices that we paid, but the bottom line is we had a starting balance for the ICA's account of $166,057.06, and we have a ending balance of $152,457.94. So we moved into calendar year 2022 with the resources to accomplish the things that the board wants to make their priorities.
Thank you.
That is all.
Any questions of Jeffrey? Now we're to the point in our agenda where we have public comment or question, if anyone, or actually, no, I always turn this over to you.
Yeah, sure.
Could you lead this?
As the chair just noticed, we do have a few guests in the audience. I don't know if anybody has any questions for the ICA. The plan, as you heard, is the next thing is the budget, which we will collaborate on. So I don't know, Mr. Binder, if you have a question, please.
It's not so much a question, it's a request.
Sure.
With the pandemic booming again, it makes it difficult for some people to attend, whether they're quarantining because they have contact or they actually have COVID. So it would be appreciative if you could not, can't manage to do like a Zoom participation from the public, to at least do a conference call option like the Liquor Control Board does. Those are free and easy to set up. So I know the public would appreciate being able to. I know you post it to your website after the fact, but that does not allow public participation if you're doing it in that way.
maybe get them moved.
It's certainly up to you. You can do that if you want. I mean, there are no rules as to how you deal with the public part. Clearly, if we're meeting live, the public can always come in and meet live. And I've already gone through that we have to have a quorum here live. But past that, you can use any electronic communication method you want.
Perhaps I'll talk to the board individually after this meeting, and we can decide whether or not there's any interest in providing an interactive. As the citizen said, these meetings are recorded to the best of our technological ability and posted on our YouTube page, which you can reach through our website. So you can't participate live through the recordings, but they do allow an after the fact documentation of the meeting. So I'll talk to the board members to see if they'd like to add a live interactive feature. We did do that when there was, at the height of COVID, there was no in-person section, but that was due to the health emergency, and the board members themselves were participating.
And that authorization has since been withdrawn.
Right.
So we're back to where we started.
Is this board covered under the sunshine law?
Yes, it does. Right. So we advertise these meetings in the Patriot News, and we post the agenda on our website 24 hours prior to the meeting. We also send it out to the media. And then the minutes and the video are both posted on our website for the public. So we obviously have done a pretty good job on transparency, and we do comply. We're a unique entity. I always remind people, we're not part of the city of Harrisburg. We are a Commonwealth agency. We're an independent Commonwealth agency. There's not too many independent Commonwealth agencies in this world where we have your own state law that created you. But that is what the ICA is, as well as the other ICA, which is in Philadelphia. It's actually, they're just much larger and have much more resources than we do. But we're actually very similar to the Philadelphia ICA.
The September legislation that was addressing meeting conduct after the withdrawal or termination of the emergency declarations does not apply to this group. So, like I said, we're back to basic Sunshine Act protocols, meetings in person, advertised, et cetera, et cetera.
And Jeffrey's very fast. I mean, the video is on tomorrow morning. And he's also very responsive if anyone has any questions.
I will say to the administration that the prior administration at one point was recording and putting our meetings on channel 21.
Yeah.
It's entirely up to the administration if you'd like to do that. We do provide some riveting content for those who like to watch channel 21. They want to hear about the financial matters of the city. We're more than happy if you'd like to return to broadcasting our meetings on the city's public information channel. That's entirely up to the administration.
That was not paid for
No.
by anyone, no PSA. Any other?
Any other questions? Sorry.
No, it's-
That's right. Any other questions? Anything from DCED today? Okay, we're good. Let's hit that to you, Madam Chair.
All right, well, let's adjourn. Can I have a motion to adjourn? Doug, second.
Second.
All right. Any opposed? All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for coming. Thank you, Brian.
Okay.